The day I found out my husband had been lying to me for 3 years, I was standing in his office, wearing the dress he bought me to impress his boss. My name is Cassandra Reeves. Most people call me Cass. I'm 34 years old. I run half of my husband's calendar. And up until 8 months ago, I believed I was the most important person in his life. I wasn't even in the top 3. Daniel, my husband, had this way of making you feel chosen. That's the only word for it. When Daniel Reeves looked at you across a room, you felt like the rest of the world had gone slightly out of focus. I fell in love with that look when I was 26 and working at a marketing firm in downtown Nashville. He was charming, ambitious, a little reckless in the way that felt exciting before it feels dangerous. We got married 2 years later. I left my job to support his. That was my choice. I want to be clear about that. But it was a choice made on information that turned out to be incomplete. The man responsible for the incomplete information was named Richard Calloway. You may have heard of him. Most people in Tennessee have. He runs Calloway Capital, private equity, commercial real estate, the kind of money that doesn't announce itself at dinner. Parties because it doesn't need to. Richard was 51, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness that powerful men develop when they've spent decades never being rushed. Daniel had been chasing Richard's partnership for 2 years. That partnership was all he talked about. It was the reason we'd moved to a bigger house in Green Hills. The reason I hosted dinners I didn't want to host. Smiled at people I didn't like. Wore dresses chosen for other people's approval. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things. The night everything cracked open, it started as a dinner party. Richard's estate in Brentwood. The kind of property that doesn't show up on Zillow because people with that kind of money don't sell. They transfer. 14 guests. Catered. String quartet on the back terrace. Daniel was electric that night, laughing too easily, touching my arm every few minutes like I was an accessory he wanted people to notice. I played my part. I always played my part. Somewhere around the second course, Richard sat down beside me, not beside Daniel, beside me, and said very quietly, "You're wasted at these things, you know." I looked at him. He didn't look away. There was something in his eyes that wasn't flattery. It was closer to recognition, like he was telling me something I already knew and had been pretending I didn't. "Excuse me?" I said, keeping my voice light. "You're the smartest person at this table," he said, "and you're spending the evening making sure everyone else is comfortable." I smiled the way I'd learned to smile. "That's very kind." He tilted his head slightly. It wasn't kindness. Then Daniel appeared at my shoulder, and Richard stood, and the moment dissolved like it had never happened, except that it had, and I felt it sitting in my chest for the rest of the night, like a coal that hadn't decided yet whether to go cold or catch fire. The documents were in Daniel's home office. In a folder he'd labeled, I almost have to laugh, miscellaneous. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for our insurance paperwork. That's the ordinary, unglamorous truth of how lives unravel. Not in dramatic confrontations, but in filing cabinets. The folder contained 3 things that changed everything. The first was a financial agreement between Daniel and Calloway Capital, one that had been signed 9 months ago. A partnership, already finalized. The partnership Daniel was still pretending to be working toward. Still using as a reason. Still using as a leash. The second document was a property deed. A condo in East Nashville purchased 8 months ago. Not in our names. In Daniel's name alone. The third was a photograph. Printed, not digital. Which told me Daniel was careful. Which told me this wasn't new. Which told me the carefulness had been practiced. I stood in that office for a long time. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. There was a moment where I thought I might. Where I felt the familiar pressure behind my eyes. And then something shifted. Something that had been soft went solid. I put the folder back exactly as I found it. I went upstairs. I took off the dress Daniel had chosen and hung it neatly in the closet. Then I lay in the dark and I started to think. Because here's what Daniel didn't know about me. What years of being underestimated will do. I had resources he'd never bothered to notice. I had time. I had access. And now I had clarity. The question wasn't whether I would do something. The question was how far I was willing to go. And Richard Calloway's business card was still in my purse. They say the most dangerous version of a woman is the one who has stopped crying and started planning. I had not cried once. It had been 11 days since I found that folder. 11 days of normal. Coffee in the morning, dinner at 7. The kind of quiet marriage that looks peaceful from the outside, because both people have stopped expecting anything from it. Daniel noticed nothing different. That told me everything. I needed to know about how closely he'd actually been paying attention. I had spent those 11 days doing what I was apparently very good at, being invisible while seeing everything. I pulled our joint financial records going back 4 years. I cataloged every transfer, every withdrawal, every account I hadn't been told about. Daniel had been quietly moving money. Not enough at once to trigger alarm, just enough consistently to build something separate. A life that ran parallel to ours like a shadow. I also did something Daniel would never have expected. I called Richard Calloway's office. His assistant, a composed woman named Diane, answered on the second ring. I gave my name. I said I was following up on a conversation from the Brentwood dinner. I said I had a business matter I believed Mr. Calloway would find relevant. There was a pause. Then, "Can you hold one moment, Mrs. Reeves?" He took the call himself. That surprised me. Or maybe it didn't. "Cassandra, not Mrs. Reeves, my first name, said the way you say something you've been thinking about." "I hope I'm not overstepping," I said, keeping my voice even. "You're not," he said. "Just that. No elaboration." I told him I'd been reviewing some of Daniel's business. Documentation. I kept it vague. Professional, and that I had questions about the structure of the Calloway capital. Agreement that I didn't feel comfortable raising with Daniel directly. I said I thought a conversation might be mutually valuable. The pause that followed was exactly 3 seconds. I counted. "Tuesday," he said. "Noon. I'll have Diane send the address." I want to be honest about something, because this story only works if I'm honest. When I walked into Richard Calloway's private office that Tuesday, I was not entirely sure what I was doing. I had a plan. I did. But plans have edges, and I was aware that I was standing very close to one. His office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Nashville, with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of furniture that communicates wealth without trying to. He stood when I came in, which I hadn't expected. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. And then, this is the part I keep thinking about, he didn't sit behind the desk. He sat in the chair beside mine. No barrier between us, a choice. "You didn't bring anything," he observed. No notepad, no folder. "I have a good memory," I said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. "Yes," he said. "I thought you might." I laid it out cleanly. I told him I knew about the finalized partnership, the one Daniel was still performing uncertainty about in every conversation. I told him I knew about the East Nashville property. I didn't show emotion. I presented it the way I'd watched Daniel present proposals 100 times. Like the information was simply facts, and facts don't require feelings. Richard listened without interrupting. That was unusual in my experience. Men like him usually redirect within 40 seconds. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want, Cassandra?" And I told him. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want a confrontation. What I wanted was leverage, and the time to use it correctly. The Calloway Capital Agreement had a clause. I'd found it on my third careful read-through. A conduct clause, standard in high-value partnerships, requiring both parties to maintain what the document called integrity of representation. In plain language, if Daniel had been misrepresenting himself, his finances, his personal circumstances, his stability during the negotiation period, the agreement could be revisited. Richard had gone very still while I explained this. "You've read the full document," he said. It wasn't a question. "I had 11 days, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. The light from the windows behind him was sharp and afternoon gold, and I was aware of how close the chairs were, and I didn't move mine back. "You know," he said slowly, "when I said you were the smartest person at that table, I understood I was making a significant statement." "I remember," I said. "I wasn't wrong." Here is where I have to tell you about the part that kept me up at night, because Richard Calloway was not a simple character in this story. He wasn't a villain and he wasn't a hero. And the more time I spent across from him, the more I understood that powerful people rarely are either. He had his own interests. He had his own reasons for listening to me, reasons that may not have been entirely separate from the fact that he found me interesting in ways that went beyond the legal. I knew that. I used that. And I won't pretend there wasn't a moment, sitting in that office, watching him watch me, where I felt the full weight of what I was doing. The calculation of it, the coldness required. I had become something I didn't entirely recognize. The question was whether that was a loss or a becoming. Richard agreed to quietly initiate a review of the partnership agreement pending documentation of certain disclosures. That was the language, clean, professional, devastating. Daniel would not see it coming. He had never once considered that I might have been paying attention. As I stood to leave, Richard stood too. He walked me to the door, and at the threshold he said, very quietly, close enough that it wasn't for anyone else. You know this changes your position too. I looked at him directly. I know. And? I picked up my bag, and I've already decided. I walked out without looking back.